My name is Clara, and for 70 years, I have believed in the quiet strength of family, a belief instilled in me by the steadfast plains of Ohio, and a long, happy marriage to a man who was as solid and dependable as the earth beneath our feet. My house in Maple Creek, a place that once echoed with the boundless energy of my son, Leo, and the warm, steady presence of my husband, Arthur, now often feels cavernous in its silence. It is a particular kind of silence, different from the peaceful quiet that used to settle over us in the evenings when Arthur would read by the fire. This new silence has edges. It is an absence, a space that was once filled and is now achingly empty. It feels heaviest during the holidays, a time that was once a symphony of laughter, boisterous grandchildren, and bustling energy, but has since become a more subdued, almost fragile performance of festivity. This Christmas was no different. The scent of roasted turkey, sage, and the cinnamon from my apple pie hung in the air, a ghost of celebrations past. The lights on the great spruce tree in the corner, a tradition Arthur and I started our first year of marriage, cast a soft, forgiving glow on everything, including the hairline cracks that had begun to form in the very foundation of my family. My son, Leo, sat across from me, the heavy oak dining table that Arthur had built separating us by more than just physical distance. His shoulders were hunched in a way that had become all too familiar since he married Chloe, a defensive posture that spoke of a constant, low-level tension. He was a good boy, my Leo, born with a heart as open and honest as the wide Ohio summer sky. But that innate goodness, that trusting nature that had become a vulnerability in the face of a world that did not share his values. Arthur used to say it himself, his voice a low rumble of paternal concern as we'd watch a younger Leo trying so hard to please everyone. He has a good heart, Clara, but he needs a strong compass, someone to keep him pointed true north, because he'll give anyone the shirt off his back, even if it leaves him shivering. For a long time, I believed I was that compass, and then Arthur was. Now I feared his compass was Chloe, and her needle pointed only toward the glittering, magnetic pull of status and acquisition. She sat beside him, a vision in a cream-colored cashmere sweater that likely cost more than my entire monthly budget, her smile perfectly painted, her gratitude for the meal just a little too effusive to be entirely sincere. I watched her throughout dinner, a habit I had developed not out of malice, but out of a protective instinct for the son whose happiness was my life's most significant work. It was in the small things that her true nature revealed itself. I noted the way her eyes, sharp and intelligent, scanned the room not with the warmth of a family member taking in familiar, beloved surroundings, but with the cool, appraising quality of an assessor. Her gaze lingered on the silver candlesticks my grandmother had passed down to me, then moved to the heavy oak dining table Arthur had built, and finally rested on the small collection of oil paintings he had acquired over 40 years of patient saving and searching. It was the detached assessment of someone calculating value, not the loving gaze of a daughter-in-law seeing a home. I remembered a Thanksgiving 2 years prior, when she'd picked up a small porcelain bird from the mantelpiece and, instead of commenting on its delicacy, had turned it over to look for the maker's mark on the bottom. When she complimented my cooking, her praise was interwoven with subtle, probing questions about the cost of organic ingredients or where I sourced my free-range turkey. A jarring note in the melody of a holiday meal, as if she were trying to deconstruct my love into a line-item budget. Leo tried. I will give him that. He attempted to steer the conversation toward the safer waters of nostalgia, of his childhood memories here in this house. He spoke of sledding down Miller's Hill on a metal saucer until his cheeks were numb, and the time he and his father tried to build a treehouse that ended up looking more like a leaning shed, a story that always used to make him laugh. But with every anecdote, his eyes would flick toward Chloe, a quick, almost imperceptible check for her approval, a silent plea for her to find his simple past as charming as he did. More often than not, she would offer a tight, polite smile before redirecting the conversation with practiced ease, turning a story about a homemade go-kart into a discussion about the new luxury SUV their neighbors had just purchased. Can you imagine? Leo, she'd say, her voice bright and pointed. Heated seats in the back for the kids. The safety rating is top of its class. And the pass, unless it could be monetized or used as a social stepping stone, held little interest for her. It was simply the quaint, unpolished prelude to the grand, successful future she was determined to build. I felt a familiar ache in my chest, a quiet grief for the easy, uncomplicated boy my son used to be. A boy who found joy in a leaning treehouse and not in the specifications of a neighbor's car. As the meal wound down, leaving behind a landscape of turkey bones and crumpled linen napkins, I rose to clear the plates. The act of gathering the dishes, of scraping and rinsing, was a small, grounding ritual. The quiet hum of the dishwasher filled the kitchen as I worked, the rhythmic sound a comfort in the growing tension that had settled over the dining room. It was in these quiet moments of domesticity that my thoughts often drifted to my brother, Richard. His death 6 months prior had left a void in my life that was as profound as it was unexpected. He was a brilliant, reclusive man who had seen the world in patterns and code, building a software empire from the quiet solitude of his basement, a universe away from our humble Ohio roots. He had never married, had no children, and had always viewed the complexities of social interaction with a kind of weary amusement. His final gift to me, the entirety of his estate, was a secret I had held close to my heart. A heavy, precious stone I hadn't yet decided how to carry. I hadn't told Leo the final sum, not because I distrusted my son, but because I knew his wife. I knew that a number of that magnitude would transform in her mind from a private blessing into a public commodity, a topic for immediate and relentless negotiation. "Mom, that was the best apple pie you've ever made," Leo said, his voice pulling me from my reverie as I stood by the kitchen counter, lost in thought. I had baked his father's favorite, a small tribute to the man who should have been sitting at the head of the table, whose quiet wisdom I missed more than ever. "I was just telling Chloe about that funny video of Dad trying to hang the Christmas lights last year, the one where he almost fell off the ladder," he added, a flicker of genuine warmth in his voice. "Do you mind if I use your laptop for a second? I can't find the video on my phone." My laptop was on the mahogany sideboard in the dining room, where I'd been looking through old digital photo albums before they arrived. A bittersweet journey into the past for a brief second. I hesitated, a fleeting internal whisper reminding me that my email was still open. I dismissed it as foolish. This was Leo, my son. The thought of harboring suspicion against him felt like a betrayal in itself. "Of course, dear," I replied from the kitchen, my voice cheerful. "Help yourself. It should be open." A few moments passed in what should have been comfortable silence, punctuated only by the clink of my wedding band against the porcelain plates in the sink. I thought of Richard again, of his quiet, almost grudging generosity. He had always told me he was building his company not for the wealth, but for the intellectual challenge, for the simple satisfaction of solving a complex puzzle. The inheritance was my security, a shield against the uncertainties of old age, a means to ensure I would never be a burden to anyone. But it was more than that. It was Richard's legacy, and I intended to honor it with quiet stewardship. Perhaps setting up a scholarship at the local high school in his name, or making a significant donation to the public library he had loved as a boy. It was a nest egg, not a jackpot. As I dried my hands on a dish towel and picked up the platter with the remaining pie, a strange, profound stillness had fallen over the dining room. The usual post-dinner chatter had ceased completely. The silence was no longer empty. It was full, charged with an unspoken, electric tension. I walked back into the room, a smile on my lips, ready to offer them another slice of pie, but the smile faltered and died on my face. Leo was standing motionless beside the sideboard, his hand still on the mouse, his face ashen. He looked as if he had seen a ghost, his eyes wide with a look of pure, unadulterated shock. Chloe was next to him, but her expression was entirely different and far more terrifying. Her perfect posture was gone. replaced by a forward-leaning intensity. Her neck craned like a bird of prey. Her painted smile was gone, too, and in its place was a look of raw, undisguised hunger that made my blood run cold. Her eyes were fixed, with a terrifying, laser-like focus on the glowing screen of my laptop. I followed her gaze, my own heart beginning to hammer against my ribs. The screen wasn't on a photo album or a funny video. It was open to my email inbox. And there, stark and undeniable in the warm Christmas light, was an email from Miller and Associates. Attorneys at law, the subject line read, "Final probate ruling estate of Richard Downing." And in the body of the email, a single highlighted figure was visible to anyone in the room, $15,000. The air in the room grew thick and heavy. All the festive warmth instantly sucked out, replaced by the chilling vacuum of a secret that was never meant to be a spectacle, but had just become the opening salvo in a war I never wanted to fight. The sound that finally broke the spell was the soft, definitive click of my laptop lid closing. My own hand had done it, an act of pure, protective instinct, as if shielding a flame from a sudden gust of wind. The obscene number that had glowed on the screen was now hidden, but its presence remained, hanging in the air between us, more real and solid than any ghost. Leo flinched as if the sound had been a gunshot, his gaze dropping to the floor in a profound, all-encompassing shame. He couldn't look at me. He couldn't look at his wife. He could only stare at the patterns in the old oak floorboards, as if they held the answers he so desperately needed. Chloe, however, did not flinch. Her eyes, which had been locked on the screen in a trance of pure avarice, slowly lifted to meet mine. In their depths, I saw the fleeting, predatory gleam get extinguished, instantly replaced by a carefully constructed mask of deep concern. The speed of her transformation was breathtaking, the work of a seasoned actress. She was an artist of manipulation, and I was, in that moment, her unwilling canvas. I said nothing about what had just transpired. To speak of it then would have been to surrender to the chaos she thrived on. Instead, I moved to collect the dessert plates with a steadiness I did not feel, my hands performing the familiar, grounding ritual of a hostess, even as my world tilted violently on its axis. "It's getting late," I said, my voice a quiet island of calm in a sea of tension. "The guest room is all ready for you. We can talk in the morning." That night, they stayed in the guest room, the same room Leo had slept in as a boy, surrounded by the faded pennants of his favorite baseball teams and the lingering ghosts of his childhood dreams. I lay awake in my own bed, the empty space beside me, where Arthur had slept for 45 years, feeling like a vast, cold expanse. Sleep was a distant country I had no hope of reaching. I did not feel the hot flush of anger. Not yet. That would come later. Instead, I was submerged in a profound and weary sadness, a sense of an inevitable event, long dreaded, finally arriving at my door. My thoughts drifted to my brother, Richard. I remembered a conversation we'd had years ago, sitting on this very porch. He had just sold a smaller, preliminary version of his software and was talking about the strange, sudden shift in how people treated him. "They don't see you anymore, Clara," he had said, swirling the ice in his glass. "They see a reflection of their own desires. They see a shortcut." I had chided him for his cynicism, for his lack of faith in people. Now, lying in the dark, the silence of the house pressing in on me, I finally understood. His caution was not cynicism, it was clarity. He had built his fortune in a world of code, of zeros and ones, of absolute logic. And he knew that a sum of money like $15 million was not just a number. It was a catalyst, a chemical agent that could reveal the true, often hidden, nature of any substance it touched. Tonight, it had touched my family, and the reaction was both immediate and devastating. Just before dawn, a thirst I couldn't quench drove me from my bed. As I padded softly down the hallway, the old floorboards groaning a quiet protest, I heard voices from their room. The house was old, built in an era of shared warmth, and a cast iron heating grate in the hallway floor, a relic of a long gone furnace system, acted as an unwitting conduit for sound. Chloe's voice was a low, urgent hiss, sharp with a manic excitement she could no longer contain. This changes everything. Leo. Everything. A woman her age, living alone in this little town, what could she possibly do with that kind of money? It's a responsibility, not a lottery ticket. It needs to be managed, invested, protected. A pause. Then Leo's muffled reply, laced with a guilt that gave me a sliver of hope. Chloe, it's her money. Her brother left it to her. It feels wrong. We can't just. His voice trailed off, weak and uncertain against the force of her conviction. We aren't just anything, she cut in, her voice hardening with impatience, but we are her family. We have children, a future to build. She's had her life. It's our turn. It is our duty to make sure that money is put to good use, not squandered on useless donations or left to rot in a bank account until she's gone. Hearing my own grandson's wife speak of my eventual death with such casual, pragmatic cruelty was a pain sharper than any I had known. Even in the raw, early days of my grief for Arthur, it was the sound of my love and sacrifice being weighed, measured, and found wanting. The next morning, the air at the breakfast table was thick with unspoken words and the cloying scent of Chloe's ambition. She looked fresh and earnest, a picture of loving concern. As she placed a hand on my arm, her touch meant to convey intimacy and care. Clara, she began, her voice a carefully rehearsed melody of solicitousness. Leo and I were talking all night, and we are just so incredibly happy for you. This is a blessing for the whole family. But we're also worried. A sum like that? It's a huge burden for one person to manage, especially now. She spoke of legacy, of building something for the grandchildren, of creating opportunities that would echo for generations. It was a masterful performance, framing their greed as foresight and their avarice as familial duty. Leo sat silently, stirring his cold coffee, a portrait of conflicted misery, unable to meet my eyes but unwilling to contradict his wife. I listened to it all, my hands wrapped around my warm mug, my gaze never leaving her face, deconstructing every false note in her symphony of deceit. When she finally finished her monologue, a hopeful, expectant smile on her lips, I took a slow sip of my coffee. I then placed the mug down on its saucer with a quiet finality that seemed to echo in the room. Chloe, I said, my voice even and calm, a placid lake over a churning abyss. I appreciate your concern, but my brother's gift is my responsibility, and mine alone. It is my security for the future, and it is not a topic for discussion or negotiation. The refusal was absolute, delivered not with anger, but with the unyielding strength of a closed door. The mask on Chloe's face didn't slip. It shattered. They left within the hour. Chloe's fury was a palpable force, radiating from her in waves of rigid silence and sharp, jerky movements as she threw their belongings into an overnight bag. The loving concern from breakfast had been replaced by a venomous contempt that she no longer bothered to conceal. Leo followed her like a shadow, his face a canvas of shame and regret, offering me a mumbled, half-hearted apology as they walked out the door, his words swallowed by the slamming of the car door. I stood at the window and watched them drive away. Chloe at the wheel, her posture stiff with rage. I saw Leo's face in the passenger window, turned toward the house, his expression one of utter desolation. The weeks that followed were defined by a profound and unsettling silence. The phone did not ring. No emails appeared in my inbox. It was not the peaceful silence I had grown accustomed to since Arthur's passing. It was a coiled, watchful silence. the quiet before a storm. I knew they were not accepting my decision. They were plotting. I felt it in the creak of the old house at night, in the rustle of the autumn leaves against the window pane, which now sounded like whispers. I was waiting for the other shoe to drop, and I didn't have to wait long. One crisp afternoon, a month after that fateful Christmas, the doorbell chimed. It was a courier, a young man with a polite, indifferent expression, holding a stiff, legal-sized cardboard envelope. I signed for it on his electronic tablet, my hand steady, but a cold knot of dread tightened in my stomach. I closed the door, the weight of the envelope in my hands feeling far heavier than its physical mass. I sat down at my husband's old writing desk in the study, the place where he had paid bills and written loving letters to me for 40 years, and slit the seal open with his silver letter opener. It was not a friendly note. The paper was thick, creamy, and expensive. The kind designed to convey importance and intimidation before a single word is read. At the top, in elegant, engraved lettering, was the name of a law firm from the city, a name I had never seen before. The words, arranged in neat, merciless paragraphs, laid out their strategy. It was a formal demand letter, a document I now understood was a predator's opening move. It began with hollow pleasantries. Speaking of their deep love and concern for me, their only surviving matriarch, it referenced Leo's position as my sole heir and their shared interest in preserving the family legacy. A phrase that tasted like poison in my mind. Then it moved from feigned affection to cold, hard demand. It formally requested that 50% of the inheritance from the estate of Richard Downing be immediately placed into an irrevocable trust. With Leo and Chloe named as the trustees and primary beneficiaries, I felt my breath catch. The audacity of it was stunning, but the worst was yet to come. The final paragraph was the true weapon. It stated, with chillingly polite language, that should I refuse to cooperate with this reasonable proposal for familial harmony, their legal counsel had been instructed to explore all available avenues to protect my interests. The letter then spelled out exactly what that meant. They would file a petition with the court to formally assess my mental and financial capacity to manage an estate of such substantial complexity. It cited my advanced age, my recent bereavement, and my social isolation as risk factors that could indicate a vulnerability to undue influence or poor financial judgment. The words swam before my eyes. Capacity, advanced age, bereavement. They were taking the deepest pains of my life, my age, my solitude, my love for my late husband, and twisting them into weapons to use against me. It wasn't just an attack on my ownership of the money, it was an attack on my mind, my dignity, my very identity as a competent, grieving, but whole human being. They were threatening to strip me of my autonomy, to declare me a confused old woman, all to get their hands on money they had not earned and did not deserve. The initial shock, the deep, searing hurt, began to recede, replaced by something else entirely. A cold, clear anger began to rise within me, sharp and pure as ice. The letter that was meant to break me had, instead, forged me into something harder. I picked up the phone, my hand no longer shaking, and with a precision I hadn't felt in years. I began to search for the number of the most formidable family law attorney in the state. I would not be a victim in my own story. The war had been declared, and I intended to win. The phone call to Jessica Miller's office was the first stone cast into a still pond, and the ripples began immediately. Her office, unlike the mahogany-paneled firms I had imagined from old movies, was a space of clean lines, glass, and cool modern art. It was a space that projected not dusty precedent, but sharp, forward-thinking strategy, much like the woman herself. Jessica was in her 40s, with intelligent eyes that missed nothing and a handshake that was firm and reassuring. She listened without interruption as I laid out the events of the past month, her expression transitioning from professional sympathy to a focused, steely concentration when I handed her the demand letter. She read it once, then a second time, her lips tightening into a thin line. "This is a classic," she said, her voice devoid of alarm. "A textbook overreach, designed to frighten and intimidate. They aren't expecting a fight, Clara. They are expecting a grieving, 70-year-old woman to capitulate." She looked at me from across her wide, glass desk, a bastion of calm professionalism. "They've made claims about your mental state and your ability to manage your finances. They will try to paint you as confused. How do we fight that?" It was the question I had been waiting for, the moment the fear could have flooded back in. Instead, I felt a quiet purpose settle over me, solid and cool. From my leather tote bag, I retrieved a simple, the 3-ring binder, its weight feeling substantial and real. "My husband, Arthur, was an engineer," I began, my voice steady. "He believed that any problem could be understood if you had enough data. He taught me to document everything, not out of distrust for the world, but for the sake of clarity." I opened the binder. The first section contained the deed to Leo and Chloe's house, alongside a copy of the cashier's check for $150,000 I had given them for the down payment, drawn directly from my retirement savings. Next to it was a simple, one-page agreement I had drafted myself and insisted Leo sign, acknowledging the amount as a personal, interest-free loan to be repaid upon the sale of the house, or from his own inheritance, at the time. He had laughed it off as one of my mom quirks. Now, in the sterile light of a lawyer's office, that memory of his laughter felt like a relic from another lifetime. I turned the page, revealing 5 years' worth of bank statements with neatly highlighted transfers. I had developed a habit of typing clarifying notes in the memo line: loan for car repair, help with property tax, emergency medical loan. Each transfer was a story of their perceived hardship and my quiet support. Following that were photocopies of emails, exchanges where Leo would describe their financial struggles in painful detail, only for me to later discover, through my own quiet observations, that they had just booked a non-refundable trip to the Caribbean, or that Chloe had a new designer coat. I had started the file years ago, a silent testament to a growing unease, a project without a name. As I sat in Jessica's office, I gave it one. "I call this Project Accountability," I said softly. "It seems the time has come to present my findings." The final section contained something more modern: screenshots, dozens of them, taken from Chloe's public social media profiles. There she was, posing with a $500 handbag, with a caption about treating yourself, posted the same week she had called me in tears, claiming they couldn't afford their son's preschool tuition. Jessica leaned forward, her eyes lighting up with a lawyer's fire. She took a moment, flipping through the pages, her initial sympathy now solidifying into righteous indignation on my behalf. "Clara," she said slowly, her voice holding a new weight, "this isn't just a binder. This is a meticulously documented history of financial deception and emotional manipulation. Their credibility is non-existent." She leaned back, a predatory smile touching her lips for the first time. "We will not just respond, we will dismantle them." She laid out the strategy: a terse, dismissive letter to their attorney rejecting their demands in their entirety, a separate, formal demand for the immediate repayment of all documented loans, a sum that totaled over $400,000, and finally, a draft of a countersuit for harassment and intentional infliction of emotional distress, which she would hold in reserve like a hidden blade. I walked out of that office an hour later, the cool Ohio air feeling fresh and clean for the first time in weeks. The knot of dread in my stomach had been replaced by a solid core of purpose. The grieving widow was gone. The frightened mother was gone. The woman who remained was simply the executor of Project Accountability. And its work had just begun. The weeks following Jessica's blistering response were an exercise in unnerving silence. The world outside my window shifted from the burnished gold of late autumn to the stark, gray bones of early winter. And still, there was no word from Leo or Chloe. This was not the silence of peace. but the heavy, charged silence of a battlefield after the first volley, where both sides have retreated to plan their next attack. I used the time methodically, transforming my quiet home into a command center. My dining room table was no longer for meals, but for sorting through decades of my life with the dispassionate focus of an archaeologist. I sorted through old bank boxes, unearthing canceled checks and forgotten notes. I read through my own journals, the entries painting a slow, heartbreaking picture of my son's gradual transformation from a bright, ambitious boy into a man who seemed to have lost his moral bearings, and my own complicity in enabling his dependence. The work was painful, forcing me to confront my own mistakes, but it was also clarifying. I was not just building a legal case, I was rebuilding my own understanding of where my love had been taken for granted and where my generosity had become a crutch. The breaking point came on a Tuesday, a day of low, steel gray clouds. My book club meeting had been canceled due to the weather, so I was home, curled up with a novel in the den, a room at the back of the house that looked out onto the dormant garden. I had heard Leo's car pull into the driveway, a surprise visit that sent a ripple of anxiety through me. He had called earlier, leaving a clipped voicemail saying he needed to stop by to pick up some of his father's old things from his childhood room. He had specifically asked if I would be home around 3, and I had told him I would be at my meeting, a small, unintentional deception that would change everything. He must have assumed the house was empty. I heard the front door open with his key, his footsteps soft on the stairs. I remained where I was, my book forgotten in my lap, my heart a nervous drum against my ribs. A few minutes later, I heard his cell phone ring upstairs. His voice, when he answered, was low and strained, and he had walked out into the upstairs hallway, directly above the old return air vent that connected to the den. "Chloe, I'm here now," he said, his voice carrying down to me with an unnatural clarity. "No, I haven't found them yet. I don't know where she keeps the recent ones. The old stuff is just old." There was a pause, and then his voice grew more agitated. "I can't just go through her desk. It feels wrong. For God's sake, Chloe, she's still my mother." Another pause, longer this time, and I could imagine her winding up her response on the other end. Then, Chloe's voice, tinny and sharp through the phone's earpiece, became audible. "She stopped being your mother when she decided to hoard that money. Leo, she is an obstacle. Are you a man, or are you still her little boy? Find the bank statements. We need them for the lawyer. Once this is over and we have the money, we are out of this depressing town. We'll move to California, just like we always talked about. You won't have to deal with her, or this house, or any of his boring old memories ever again. I promise." The cruelty of it, the cold, transactional nature of her words that was staggering. But it was the final sentence, the casual dismissal of his father's memory, that landed the fatal blow on my son. I felt the shattering of his world from the floor below. There was a long, heavy silence. I pictured his face, the slow dawning of comprehension, the realization that he was not her partner, but her accomplice. Her promise of a future with him was conditional on his complete and utter betrayal of his past. He said something, too quiet for me to hear, a choked syllable, and then the call ended. I heard a soft thud, as if he had slumped against the wall in the hallway. I stayed perfectly still, my own breathing shallow, granting him the privacy of his disillusionment. Minutes later, I heard his slow, heavy footsteps descend the stairs. The front door opened and closed with a quiet click. I walked to the window and watched his car back out of the driveway, moving not with purpose, but with the defeated drift of a ship whose rudder had just been torn away. The united front of my son and his wife was broken. It was a terrible, painful victory, but it was a victory nonetheless. And I knew, with chilling certainty, that it was only the beginning. The invitation arrived on thick, cream-colored cardstock, its elegant script announcing the 40th wedding anniversary of my cousin, Sarah, and her husband, Tom. It was an event of significance within our sprawling family tapestry, a milestone that guaranteed the attendance of every important branch. It was to be held at the Maple Creek Country Club, a place of manicured lawns and hushed conversations, where social standing was the unspoken currency. I knew, with a certainty that settled deep in my bones, that this would be the stage Chloe had chosen for her next performance. She would not confront me directly. Her methods were far more insidious. She would use the weight of collective family opinion as her weapon, isolating me within the very community that was meant to be my support. For a fleeting moment, I considered declining, but then I looked at the worn, folded demand letter from her lawyer, a permanent fixture now on my husband's desk. Retreat was no longer an option. Project accountability required me to see this through. I chose my dress with care, a simple, elegant navy blue silk, the color of quiet confidence. I was not going to battle, I was going to a party, and I would carry myself with the grace and dignity they were so desperately trying to strip from me. When I walked through the grand doors of the country club, the main ballroom was already humming with the cheerful energy of a celebration. My eyes, however, immediately found Leo and Chloe near the grand fireplace, and my heart gave a familiar, painful lurch. Leo looked diminished. He stood slightly behind his wife, a ghost in a well-tailored suit, his shoulders slumped, his eyes tracing patterns on the Persian rug. There were dark circles under his eyes that spoke of sleepless nights, of a war being waged within himself. He looked up, and for a second, our gazes met across the crowded room. I saw a flicker of raw shame, of a profound sorrow that was almost a plea, before he quickly looked away, turning his attention to a conversation he clearly wasn't hearing. He had not called or visited since that day in my hallway. I knew he was wrestling with his new, ugly knowledge, and the battle was taking its toll. Chloe, by contrast, was radiant, a dark star absorbing all the light around her. She was a master of social theater, moving through the room with a practiced, sorrowful grace, her hand resting lightly on an uncle's arm, her voice a low, confidential murmur in a cousin's ear. I did not need to hear the words to know the script. I saw it in the sympathetic, pitying glances sent my way. I felt it in the way a few distant relatives seemed to find their conversations on the other side of the room suddenly more fascinating as I approached. As I passed one cluster of relatives, I caught a snippet of her work, her voice carrying on a current of feigned concern. Uh, all alone in that big house, and she won't let us help. We're just so worried. She was leveraging 30 years of goodwill I had built within this family, turning my reputation for quiet strength into evidence of cold detachment and mental decline. I found a small table near the French doors overlooking the golf course as dusk settled, and I sat, allowing the performance to unfold. I felt a strange sense of detachment, as if I were watching a play for which I already knew the ending. The anger that had propelled me to Jessica's office had now cooled into a calm, patient resolve. Let her set the stage. Let her convince the audience. I knew my part was coming. I spoke with my cousin Sarah, the guest of honor, and her husband, Tom, offering my sincere congratulations. They were warm, but there was a new, careful quality to their interaction, a gentle probing in their questions. I felt the web Chloe was weaving tightening around me, a delicate, sticky trap of concern and suspicion. Leo continued to avoid me, finding solace near the bar. He looked like a man stranded on a desert island, surrounded by people but utterly alone. The weight of his complicity and his wife's cruelty was crushing him, and yet he still stood in the same room with her, a testament to the powerful toxic hold she had on him. As the evening wore on, the collective narrative in the room began to solidify. I was no longer just Clara. I was becoming a problem to be solved, a sad story to be whispered about. The isolation was a tangible thing, a cool draft in the warm, crowded room. Chloe was counting on the pressure to make me crumble. She had underestimated, however, the strength of a woman who had already lost everything that truly mattered and had nothing left to fear. The moment I had been anticipating arrived just after the champagne toast. It was Sarah who approached me, her brow furrowed with a carefully cultivated concern that I knew was a reflection of Chloe's handiwork. She pulled a chair up to my small table, her husband, Tom, standing protectively behind her. "Clara, dear," she began, her voice low and earnest. "We need to talk. I'm worried about you. Chloe has been telling us some very troubling things. She says you're not yourself since Richard passed, that this money has become a terrible burden. She's afraid you're being taken advantage of." It was the perfect opening, delivered by a person I loved, which made the poison all the more potent. I did not raise my voice. I did not protest. I simply met her gaze with a calm sadness. "Sarah, I appreciate your concern more than you know," I said softly. "The story is indeed troubling, but I fear you have only heard one version of it. Would you, and Tom, and perhaps Uncle Robert, be willing to hear my side, not here, somewhere more private?" My request for a private council of the family's most respected elders threw them off balance. It was not the reaction of a confused person, it was a request for due process. Sarah agreed immediately, and a few minutes later, we were gathered in the club's small oak-paneled library. The air smelled of old leather and furniture polish. Sarah, Tom, and my Uncle Robert, a man whose judgment the entire family trusted implicitly, sat in the leather armchairs. Chloe and Leo were asked to join us. Chloe entered with an air of reluctant triumph, as if attending a hearing she had graciously granted me. Leo followed, his face the color of ash. Once the door was closed, a heavy silence settled. I began. "I will not take much of your time," I started, my voice even and measured. "I only wish to provide some context." I looked at Sarah. "You know that I helped Leo and Chloe with the down payment for their home. What you may not know is that it was a documented loan for $150,000, drawn from the retirement fund Arthur and I had built, an agreement which Leo signed." A flicker of surprise crossed Tom's face. I continued, addressing the group. "I have been told that they are struggling. It's true they have asked for my help. What may have been omitted is that their requests for assistance with groceries have often coincided with their social media posts from luxury resorts." The atmosphere in the room grew cooler. Chloe shifted, her confident posture stiffening. "And finally," I said, reaching into my handbag, "there is the matter of my confusion." I pulled out the folded, worn pages of the demand letter. I did not read it aloud. I simply unfolded it and handed it to Uncle Robert. "This is a letter I received from my grandson's wife a month ago. By way of her attorney, I believe the final paragraph, which questions my mental capacity, is of particular interest." Uncle Robert put on his reading glasses, the only sound in the room the faint rustle of the paper. His expression slowly changed from concern to disbelief, and then to a quiet, simmering anger. He passed it to Tom, who read it and handed it to Sarah, whose face paled. The letter, with its cold threats against a grieving, 70-year-old woman, did more to destroy Chloe's narrative than any emotional plea I could have made. Sarah slowly folded the letter, her eyes, now clear of any pity, locking onto Chloe. "Chloe," she said, her voice dangerously quiet. "Did you send this, Chloe?" For the first time, that was utterly exposed. Her mask of concerned victimhood had been incinerated by the bright, hot flame of the truth. She opened her mouth, but no words came out. Sarah then turned to my son. "Leo, is this true?" The weight of 3 generations of family integrity rested on his shoulders. He looked at the disappointed faces of his family. He looked at me, and I offered him nothing but the quiet stillness of the truth. He looked at his wife, and in his eyes I saw the war I had witnessed for weeks finally reach its conclusion. The spell was broken. He took a deep, shuddering breath. "Yes," he said, his voice cracking but clear. "It's all true. My mother has been nothing but good to us, and we I have been wrong. The admission hung in the air, an irrefutable confession. Chloe gasped, a sound of pure fury. Leo, tell them, she hissed. Tell them she's manipulating you. He just shook his head, refusing to look at her. That was her final defeat. She stood up abruptly, her chair scraping against the hardwood floor. You are all fools, she spat, her voice venomous. He is a weak, foolish boy, and you are all just like him. She stormed out of the library, slamming the door behind her. Leo remained standing, a solitary, broken figure. But in his eyes, as he finally met my gaze, I saw not just the end of a lie, but the barest, most fragile flicker of a new beginning. The slam of the library door echoed in the profound silence Chloe left behind, a sound that seemed to suck all the remaining warmth from the room. For a long moment, no one moved. We sat like figures in a tableau, the ugly truth of the evening laid bare on the polished table between us. Leo stood frozen, his face a mask of such profound shame that I had to look away. A mother's instinct to shield her child from pain warring with the cold necessity of this moment. It was Uncle Robert who spoke first, his voice a low, gravelly rumble of authority that had settled family disputes for 50 years. He looked at me, his eyes filled not with pity, but with a deep, regretful respect. Clara, he said, and my name in his mouth sounded like an apology. I am sorry. We listened to gossip when we should have listened to our hearts. Your brother Richard always said you were the strongest of us all. It seems he was right. You have handled this with a grace none of us deserved. Sarah and Tom echoed his sentiments, their words a soothing balm on a wound I hadn't realized was so raw. The feeling of being believed, of being seen clearly for the first time in months, was a relief so potent it almost brought me to tears. Our collective attention then turned to Leo. He hadn't moved, his gaze fixed on the spot where his wife had stood. He looked like a man who had just witnessed the demolition of his own house, standing amidst the rubble, unsure of where to even begin, sifting through the wreckage for something to salvage. Son, Uncle Robert said gently, his voice losing its stern edge. This is a hard road, but the first step to fixing a mistake is to stop making it, to turn around and start walking back toward where you lost your way. Leo finally looked up, his eyes meeting mine. There were no excuses in his gaze, no pleas for mitigation. There was only the stark, desolate landscape of self-awareness. I know, he whispered, the words barely audible. I have a lot to answer for. He turned and left the library without another word, not with the furious storm of his wife, but with the quiet, heavy gait of a man carrying a new and terrible burden. I knew he was not going home to reconcile. He was going home to face the consequences of a decade of willful blindness and moral cowardice. The days that followed were a strange mixture of quiet vindication and pervasive sorrow. The story of what had transpired in the library spread through the family with the speed of a winter fire. The phone began to ring. It was my cousin Beth, her voice thick with apology. Clara, I feel just awful, she confessed. Chloe had me convinced. She showed me pictures of the children in old clothes and told me you wouldn't even help with school supplies. Last year, I saw her buy a $3,000 purse and she told me it was a cheap knockoff she'd bought online. I believed her. Each call was a similar story, a small stone being removed from the mountain of doubt that had been built around me. But each one also brought a pang of sadness. The validation of my position was inextricably linked to the public disgrace of my only son. It was a victory that tasted of ash. I learned through these conversations that Chloe's social world, the one she had so meticulously curated, had crumbled. The invitations to dinner parties stopped. The friendly calls from her circle of admirers ceased. She had built her identity on a foundation of perceived success and victimhood, and when the truth was revealed, the entire structure collapsed. A week later, Leo called me. His voice was flat, hollowed out. He told me he had moved out of the house and was staying in a small, furnished apartment across town. He described, in painful detail, the final confrontation with Chloe. It was not a conversation, but a diatribe of pure venom. She had accused him of betraying her, of siding with me against his own family, of being a weak, spineless coward who would always be hiding in his mother's shadow. She saw no fault in her own actions, no flaw in her own character. The entire catastrophe was, in her mind, his fault for failing to control me. When he told her he was leaving, she had laughed, a sharp, ugly sound. Good, she had apparently said. I'm tired of carrying a dead weight. He packed a single suitcase, leaving behind the house I had helped them buy and the life he had thought was his. I listened, my heart aching for the pain in his voice, but I offered no easy words of comfort. This was his path to walk, his consequence to bear. The final domino fell 2 weeks after that. Leo lost his job. He recounted the conversation with his boss, the regretful but firm tone explaining that his performance had fallen off a cliff. The man who had been a star salesman, full of easy charm and relentless confidence, was gone. In his place was a man haunted by his own choices, his focus shattered. Leo resigned that afternoon, with his income gone, and my financial support permanently cut off. The last pillar they're holding up their artificial life was gone. The beautiful house with its granite countertops went into foreclosure. The luxury cars were repossessed. The entire glittering facade they had spent a decade constructing, funded by my love and their lies, had disintegrated into dust. I let another month pass, a period of quiet observation and deliberate stillness. The harsh winds of winter gave way to the first tentative hints of a thaw. I spent my time in the garden, planning for the spring, clearing away the dead foliage from the previous year. It felt symbolic. This act of tending to new life while the old life of my son and his wife withered. I saw Leo's car, a modest used sedan, at the local grocery store. He looked thinner, but the weary slump in his shoulders was gone, replaced by a kind of quiet resolve. He was working a temporary job at a local hardware store, a humbling fall from his previous life. But he was working. He was paying his own rent. He was, for the first time in his adult life, standing on his own 2 feet, however unsteady they might be. The silence between us was no longer charged with anger or deceit. It was the quiet of a fallow field, waiting to see what, if anything, might grow again. But there was still the matter of the dead. It was the last ghost in the room, the tangible sum of years of misplaced generosity and blatant disrespect. It was Arthur's life's work, my security, and the price of their choices. It had to be addressed. I sat once more across the glass desk from Jessica Miller. I explained the situation, the collapse of Leo's previous life, and the small, fragile signs of his new one. I don't want to destroy him. Jessica, I said, the words feeling heavy and true. He is my son. He is already paying a terrible price. But I cannot simply erase this. The money represents more than just dollars. It represents a fundamental breach of the trust that holds a family together. Accountability must have a price, or it has no meaning. Jessica nodded, her expression unreadable but understanding. Accountability is not the same as revenge. Clara, she said, echoing her words from our first meeting. Revenge is about causing pain. Accountability is about restoring balance. We can draft a proposal that gives him a path forward, a way to make amends, but it must acknowledge the gravity of the debt. It closes the book, legally and emotionally. Her words gave me clarity. This was not about punishment. It was about closing the ledger. The document Jessica's office prepared was a masterpiece of cold, legal precision. It was not a vicious attack, but an undeniable statement of fact. It was an official, final demand for repayment of the $412,000 in documented loans. It meticulously cited each major loan agreement, each signed acknowledgement, creating an irrefutable paper trail that no court would dismiss. This was the ultimatum. It gave them a clear and final choice: contact Jessica's office within 30 days to negotiate a structured settlement and a realistic payment plan. Or I would be forced to file a civil lawsuit to recover the full amount. The document made the consequences of the second option clear. A court judgment would inevitably lead to wage garnishments, liens, and a forced bankruptcy that would follow both Leo and Chloe for years to come. It was a hard choice, but it was a choice. It was more than they had ever offered me. A process server delivered the envelope to the foreclosed home, where Chloe was apparently still living, a queen reigning over a crumbling kingdom of cardboard boxes and unpaid bills. I pictured the scene in my mind: the formal knock on the door, Chloe's irritation turning to fury as she recognized the legal format, the color draining from her face as she read the staggering sum. I imagined her screaming at Leo over the phone, accusing him of conspiring with me, her voice a torrent of blame and vitriol. But I knew, with a certainty I couldn't explain, that Leo's reaction would be different. For him, that number would not be a surprise. It would be a reckoning. It would be the bill for his life, finally come due. That evening, I sat in my quiet study, the house still and peaceful around me. I turned off my phone for the evening, silencing the outside world. I felt no triumph, no surge of victory. I felt only the profound, somber quiet of a necessary thing, long overdue, finally being done. Says, I had honored Arthur's memory. I had honored my own dignity. I had closed the ledger on a lifetime of misguided generosity. The ball was now in his court. I had made my move, and now I would simply wait. The ultimatum had been sent, a final, definitive statement in a conflict I never sought. After that, I did not wait by the phone. The quiet of my house no longer felt like the heavy silence of dread, but like the calm, clean space of a slate wiped clean. I focused on the small, tangible rituals of my life. I tended to the dormant rose bushes in the garden, pruning away the dead wood to make way for new growth. I attended my book club, losing myself in the lives of fictional characters, a welcome respite from the drama of my own. I was reclaiming my life from the shadow of their greed, piece by piece. I had made my move, a declaration that my dignity was not for sale and my husband's legacy was not a commodity. The next move was not mine to make. For 2 weeks, there was nothing. I almost began to believe that they had chosen to let the lawsuit proceed, to let the cold, impersonal machinery of the law grind their lives into dust. I had made my peace with that possibility. The call, when it came, that was not from Leo, but from Jessica Miller. Her voice was professional, devoid of any triumphant tone. Clara, she said, I've just received a communication, not from Chloe's original attorney, but from a small legal aid office downtown. My heart gave a small, nervous flutter. Legal aid meant Leo had no money for a high-priced lawyer. It meant he was alone in this. He is not contesting the validity of the debt. Jessica continued, and I let out a breath I didn't realize I had been holding. He is acknowledging it in full. His counsel is requesting a meeting to discuss a potential repayment structure, however modest it may be. He is acting on his own behalf. Mrs. Anderson Chloe is not a party to this request. The distinction was critical. This was not a negotiation from a place of entitlement. This was the action of a man attempting to face his own ruin. I agreed to the meeting. We met in a quiet corner of a local coffee shop, a neutral ground filled with the scent of roasted beans and the low murmur of strangers' lives. I arrived early, choosing a small table by the window. When Leo walked in, I was struck by how much older he looked. The last vestiges of the charming, carefree boy were gone, replaced by a man who looked as though he had been worn down to his very foundations. He was thinner, his clothes were simpler, and his eyes held a deep, weary sorrow that was far more poignant than his previous shame. He approached the table and sat, not offering a handshake or a hug, but simply meeting my gaze directly for the first time in what felt like a lifetime. He didn't begin with apologies or excuses. He began with a gesture of profound, humbling responsibility. He slid a single, folded piece of paper across the table. It was a handwritten budget. I unfolded it. His new, modest income from the hardware store was listed at the top. Below were his expenses: the rent for his small apartment, utilities, groceries, gas for his used car. The numbers were stark. At the bottom of the page, he had circled a final figure, a small sum of money that was all that remained. He had drawn an arrow from it and written, "Monthly payment to you." It was a pittance, an amount so small it would take him centuries to repay the full debt. But the amount was not the point. The gesture was everything. It was the most honest and honorable thing I had seen him do in 15 years. "I know it's not much," he said, his voice quiet and rough. "But it's a start. I will pay you back, Mom. Every penny, for as long as it takes." Only then, after the business was acknowledged, did he allow his composure to crack. His eyes welled up, and he looked down at his hands, resting on the table. "Mom," he began, his voice thick with emotion. "There are no words to say how sorry I am. Not just for the money, for everything. For every time I took you for granted. For every time I let Chloe speak of you with disrespect. For every time I stood by and said nothing. I let her poison my heart against you. Because I was weak. And because it was easier than standing up to her. I failed you as a son. And I failed Dad's memory." He finally looked up, the tears now tracking paths down his face. "I don't expect you to forgive me. I just needed you to hear it." I listened, letting his words, raw and painful, and fill the space between us. And in that moment, I saw my own part in the tragedy with a painful clarity. "Leo," I said softly, and he looked up, surprised. "You have much to apologize for, and that is true, but perhaps I do, too." He stared at me, confused. "In my desire to give you a better life than I had, to make sure you never struggled, I gave you things. I wrote checks. I solved your problems. I think," I said, the admission tasting like rust in my mouth. "I made life so easy for you that I forgot that love isn't just about giving. It's about teaching resilience. I forgot to let you learn how to be strong on your own." My confession seemed to break something in him, and he let out a choked sob, the sound of a boy's heart breaking in a grown man's chest. I reached across the table and, for the first time in years, placed my hand on his. "The money is just paper, Leo. The real debt is one of character. And today, you have begun to repay it." Spring arrived in Maple Creek that year, not with a sudden burst, but with a slow, tentative grace. The gray skies softened to a pale blue, and the crocuses I had planted in the fall began to push their way through the cold to hard earth. It felt like a metaphor for our new reality. My relationship with Leo was not miraculously healed. It was in a fragile, nascent stage, being rebuilt one tentative conversation, one shared, quiet moment at a time. The lawsuit was formally dropped. The ultimatum had served its purpose. I had told Leo that the financial debt was forgiven, but the moral debt was now his to manage. He seemed to understand. He did not celebrate or show relief, but simply nodded, accepting the terms of his new life with a quiet gravity. He started visiting on Saturdays, not to ask for anything, but to help. The first time, he helped me clear the winter debris from the garden beds. The next, he fixed a leaky faucet in the kitchen that I had been ignoring for months. Then, one Saturday, he asked if he could try and get his father's old car running. It was a 1968 convertible, a beautiful machine that had been Arthur's pride and joy. but it had sat dormant under a canvas tarp in the garage for the 5 years since his death. It felt like an impossible task, a machine too long silent to ever wake again. I agreed. We spent the afternoon in the garage, the air smelling of old oil, dust, and damp concrete. We didn't talk much. The work became our conversation. I would hand him a wrench. He would patiently explain what a gasket was. We were two people learning a new language, one of simple and shared tasks and comfortable silence. It was more real than any conversation we had had in a decade. During a break, as we sat on two overturned buckets, sipping lemonade, he told me the divorce was final. He spoke of Chloe not with anger, but with a kind of weary detachment. After the foreclosure was finalized, she had moved to Florida, he said, to live with her sister and start over. She had taken nothing from their old life but her clothes and her bitterness. He said it without emotion, a simple statement of fact, closing a chapter of his life. He seemed lighter, as if a great weight had been lifted from his soul. He was no longer defined by her ambition or her anger. He was simply Leo. Later, while cleaning out the glove compartment, he found an old, faded photograph of Arthur, young and smiling, leaning against the car on the day he bought it. Dad would have known how to fix this in an hour, Leo said with a sad smile. I looked at the photo, at the ghost of my husband's bright, optimistic grin. He would have, I agreed. But he also would have said that some things are worth taking your time on, just to get them right. Leo looked at me, a deep understanding passing between us. He knew I wasn't just talking about the car. Weeks turned into a month, and our Saturday ritual continued. Then, one afternoon, it happened. After countless hours of tinkering, after replacing belts and spark plugs and cleaning out lines, Leo turned the key in the ignition. The engine sputtered, coughed, and then, with a deep, throaty roar, it rumbled to life. The sound filled the small garage, a powerful, vibrant pulse after years of silence. It was a resurrection. We didn't cheer or hug. Leo simply leaned against the fender, wiping the grease from his hands with a rag, and a slow, genuine smile spread across his face. He looked at me, and I smiled back. It was a smile of shared accomplishment, of a difficult task completed, of something broken being made whole again. I looked at my son, his face smudged with grease, his eyes clear and focused. He was no longer the weak boy who followed, nor the broken man who had lost his way. He was a man who was building something, slowly and carefully, with his own two hands. And in that moment, I knew with absolute certainty that the debt, the real debt, had finally been paid in full. The future was still an unwritten page, but for the first time in a long, long time, it felt full of hope.